Hi, everyone. Welcome to this Wings seminar presentation of the ABCs of instrument flying. I'm really excited to give this talk because this is one of my newer talk, and this is from my discoveries, training lots of multi-engine commercial pilots, training CFIIs, training IFR students. I've had several IFR students who have been able to graduate in just a month because they're so good at doing this technique. So I just want to give you an idea of what it's about. If you want Wings credit, I have a registration link. It's a bit.ly link. It's bit.ly, which is just a shortcut, and then it's ABC instrument. Go ahead and take a picture of that. Throughout this presentation, I'm going to give you 2 series of code words, and in the sign in, you will be prompted to write down the code words, and that's my way of verifying to the FAA you've attended through most of the training. But once you've finished, you will receive a Wings credit if you submit your email, and that's going to be great if you want a flight review later on. So here's the agenda for today. We're going to talk about 3 things. So first, why is this ABC structure effective? How I discover it and how it's working for other people. This ABC structure is not a new thing. It's been around for decades, but I modified it, modernized it over time, and it's been working out really well for most students. And we're going to give an example of how to apply this. And then the third is we're going to practice. So that's the structure of what we're doing today. So first, I want to open with why this structure is effective. Now, when you learn IFR, a lot of people jump in and they just go, let's fly, 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 fly. Okay, because they think that if they fly a lot, they will be really good at IFR flying. But in fact, for me, what I've discovered with my student is first, I need to teach you a very structured IFR procedure, a way that will help you organize your thoughts and be really predictable. Like, that's the big thing about IFR is you're always doing something in a predictable and consistent way, because the moment an instrument fails, the moment an engine failed, the moment you have any aircraft system, you can respond appropriately. The way that many people come in flying IFR, now I've met and done a stage check for IFR students, CFIIs, brand new students, but the way that most people fly IFR is they kind of wing it. Okay, they're just like, well, this time I do it this way, this other time I do it this other way. The problem with that is the moment you have some abnormality, an engine failure, an engine instrument system, I train students in a simulator, and whenever I give an instrument failure, half of the people end up crashing the airplane within a minute, right? Because the workload is so incredibly high in that moment that if you don't have a very organized, structured way to approach this, it's incredibly difficult. Now, I'll tell you how I discover the structure. So I've learned many different structures. You might have heard Bill Bug Brief, BBB, or the 5 A's, ADAS, airport, approach, all the different structures. And this is the thinking that comes behind why I discovered the structure. I was teaching a lot of multi-engine commercial pilots. And one of the things that we have to do in commercial multi-engine pilots training is to teach people how to respond if you're flying a really complex airplane, one of your engine fail, and you're in actual IMC. How do you fly that plane all the way to the ground perfectly to standards and be able to respond to both the engine problem that you're having, or maybe a partial piano problem, and also at the same time fly a flawless approach to ACS standard, like within 50 feet of exactly where you need to be. And that's where the power of this ABC structure comes in, is it allows you to handle incredible amount of complexity in a very organized and structured way. So let me introduce what it is, why it's effective, and how we use it. The first thing to know about this structure, let me see if I can do this. Okay, is you apply this ABC structure like an IFR checklist, as in it's a read, do, and verify. And I'll show you how to apply this pretty soon. Oftentimes when we talk about briefing an approach, an IFR approach, people are sort of just breezing through, reading things off, and almost kind of like showing off this, let me show you how fast I can brief an approach. But the problem with that is you won't remember anything you said. So the structure allows you to pause and think through each step and allow you to make critical aeronautical decisions quickly. And you're very clear on what's happening right now in this moment and what's going to happen next. And the most important thing is you're having this consistent, predictable structure. So you can always troubleshoot when something is wrong. Because if you're constantly changing things on while you're flying, very hard to troubleshoot, like an instrument failure, system failure. So let's talk about what this ABC structure is. It's very simple. The A stand for ATIS, AWOS. The B stand for brief approach, and the C stand for checklist. But we're going to use this as your final checklist, your IFR checklist before you come in for a landing. And that's what we're talking about. So in the world of IFR, there are many phases of flight. There's the departure, which is taken off. Then there's the en route structure, which is just cruising along. And then there's the approach to landing phase of the flight. So for today's presentation, just for the scope of our conversation, we're just going to talk about the approach to landing. Now, just because we're talking about it in terms of IFR doesn't mean that this is not a great idea to do in a VFR world, in all of your flying too. So the first step is to get the ATIS AWOS, because you need to make sure, could you even land there? There are multiple ways to get ATIS AWOS. So a lot of people just wait until they're close to the airport and listen to ATIS. And if they're too far, then they have no idea what the weather is. What I want to introduce to you is that there are many different ways to get the ATIS and AWOS or other weather information to give you just an idea of what the weather is. Could I land there? What runway would be most preferable to me? So one is ATIS AWOS over radio frequencies, which most people know. I love to use an app called AeroWeather app that gives me a lot of information. There's a digital ATIS app that gives me information for big airports, and that gives me digital information. There's ForeFlight with ADS-B that gives weather, and you can also ask Flight Service Station. Oftentimes you can ask ATC as well. You know, I'm not able to get the ATIS right now. I'm out of range. Do you know what the weather is? Now, let me show you an example of some of the apps that I really love to use. AeroWeather app is free, and you can download it. So take a look on the left side. It tells me the wind, visibility, temperature, dew point. Also tells me, depending on the airport, pressure, altitude, density, altitude. So I don't have to calculate it. It tells me the TAF, and you can get it raw or decoded. It's great. Digital ATIS app. This is when I was flying corporate and we're flying into big airports, all the captains, right? These are retired United American Airline captains. They were using this digital ATIS app. It's fantastic. It gives you all the information. So here's San Jose, ATIS information alpha, It gives you the wind, which approach to anticipate, which runway, gives you all the NOTAMs. This is exactly what you would hear if you are listening to San Jose ATIS. And then ForeFlight also incredible information as well.
Does the AeroWeather app have NOTAMs?
Depends. Sometimes you would need a pro, I think, version to get NOTAMs, but definitely if you want the full NOTAMs, like ForeFlight is the best to get all the NOTAMs. But all the other apps like AirWeather or Digital ATIS app, weather is really helpful to see. So a lot of people just listen to ATIS and then just jot down all the information and says, yep, I got ATIS. And then I asked them, well, what did you get? Like, what kind of decisions have you made listening to ATIS? And that's what we're going to be talking about today, is oftentimes you receive information, but it's almost like it goes in one ear and goes straight out the other. So what we're going to talk about is how do you interpret the information that you get and make critical aeronautical decisions at the moment that you receive it. And the first thing to look at is time. Like, how current is the weather report? And then what you're listening for is the wind and the strength. So should you even attempt a landing, right? With the reported wind, is it headwind, tailwind, or crosswind? What is your personal limitations and what's the POH limitations? Here's an example. If you are flying into Half Moon Bay, right, for a brunch, and it's overcast and you're coming down, one of the things that you need to know about the wind is how strong is it? Because oftentimes you would land on RNAV 30, you would land on runway 30, but you would take off runway 12. And so ideally, the wind would be 5 knots or below. That way you can accept a tailwind in either direction. There are some airports like in Tahoe where it's one in, one direction in, and you got to go the other direction out because of the terrain, because of the way approaches and departures works. So you're always thinking about the wind of like, if I come in, can I leave later on? Can I accept a tailwind? At Reed-Hillview, for example, if you are doing an IFR departure, leaving Reed-Hillview, you can only depart runway 31, specifically 31 left. So if everyone was doing traffic pattern on runway 13, the IFR traffic always depart 31 because of the way the departure is designed. So you have to know, like, could I accept a tailwind? We had a crew of a flight instructor and a student who were about to take off runway 31 when someone chimed on the radio and said, did you check the wind? Because it's 15 knot tailwind for you. So the pilot sheepishly taxied back and departed VFR, right? So the wind is really important, and it determines which runway you should land on. We'll talk about that next too. Next thing you're looking for is ceiling and visibility. The ceiling and visibility determines, could you fly the approach and land safely? Does it meet the ceiling and visibility requirement? Because every approach have a ceiling and visibility requirement. Now the temperature and dew point tells you, well, is the weather gonna get worse? So for example, if I'm doing a night flight and I take off and it's VFR, but I see the temperature and dew point pretty close together. And what I mean by that is 3 Celsius or less. That's a yellow flag for me. If I see that, even if I'm departing VFR and it's a sky clear 10 miles statute of visibility, but I see is 15 Celsius, dew point 12 Celsius, I'm bringing an IFR rated airplane. I'm making sure I'm IFR rated and current, because I'm ready to fly an IFR approach if I needed to, because it might mean that the weather will start closing in on me. So don't just treat the weather as what is. I'm thinking, what's happening next, right? What's now, what's next? Altimeter setting, something that oftentimes we don't talk about a lot, and I want to cover this really well for you. So often when you depart, you would set the altimeter setting for whatever your airport says. Then along the route, ATC gives you a bunch of altimeter setting. Here's the question is, well, when do you set the local altimeter setting for the airport that you're coming into land? There are 3 strategies. So I'm going to give that to you. In the AIM, they actually gives you recommendations. The first recommendation is, it says, when instructed by ATC to switch over. And the way that ATC will instruct you to change over a local altimeter is not a direct instruction. They'll say something like, advise when you have the ATIS at this airport. Advise when you have the AWOS. Think of this as a trigger. So I think trigger and action. If I hear ATC says, advise when you have alpha at Reed Hillview, that's the moment when I switch over local altimeter setting. Otherwise, I stay to what ATC last told me. The AIM also suggests that you can switch within 50 nautical miles of the airport. Now, in my opinion, that is quite far. And oftentimes, if you're that far, ATC gives you a bunch of altimeter settings along the way. So my next recommendations, and this is not in the book, is when you're within 10 miles radius of an airport or 10 miles from an approach fix. That's when you're going to switch over to whatever altimeter setting you heard on the ATIS or AWOS. And then the last thing you're listening for is the expected runway, approach, known delay, closures, and any ATIS letter to let ATC know. Now, we talk about this idea of deciding, thank you, which runway to land. Here's an example in Santa Barbara. Let's say the wind is 250 at 10 knots. Here's the question, which approach should we fly? There are 2 approaches to Santa Barbara. So one approach is designed for runway 25, and one approach is designed for runway 7. Now, most people would answer this question with, we should use the approach that's designed for a runway 25, because that the wind is favoring runway 25. One thing that you would learn when you train with me is I get you to think deeper than that. Right? Just because the wind's reporting 250 doesn't mean you should do the approach for runway 25. Because if you take a look at this approach and the minimums, depending on what stage you are in your IFR training, maybe this is new for you. But if you take a look at these numbers at the bottom here, and I'm going to annotate here, hope you can see that. So runway 25 approach gets me down to 920 feet. That gives me that minimums, right? Guidance, positive course guidance. But if I was lining up for runway 7 and I was circling, it actually gets me down to 800 feet. So what's interesting is I could fly an approach for a runway that's not with the runway that I'm coming in, and it can bring me lower if I circle to the other runway. This depends on how you feel about circling. Sometimes circling to another runway is more dangerous. Sometimes it's a very familiar airport and it is easy for you. But what I want to get you to start thinking in this class is to start thinking, is not to just automatically go to an answer, but to have that critical thinking. Okay, what is this telling me? Now, let's talk about the briefing of the approach, and you'll see what I mean by this critical thinking. Most people, when they brief an approach, they do it very fast, and they do it in 30 seconds, 1 minute. Blah, 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 done. And then I turn to them and I go, okay, what did you get out of that? And they forgot most of it. The problem with that is, let's say you have an instrument failed or an engine that failed, and now your workload is so high and you have no recollection of what you just briefed. Now you have double trouble, right? You have the issues that you're trying to solve with your aircraft, and now you still have to follow this IFR course. So this is how I teach my students to brief the approach. It takes a little bit longer. It's a lot more thorough, and it makes sure that they make no mistakes. My concept of briefing an approach is using it as an IFR checklist. So you plan your approach, you strategize, you always verify, verify, and verify again, and you read from left to right, top to bottom. The first thing you read is the name of the plate. In this case is the ILS or localizer runway 7 at Santa Barbara, and you verify that is the correct date. And then you pause. And in that moment, you load the approach in the GPS. You verified this is the ILS runway 7. This is Santa Barbara. The GPS database is current. The plate is current. And here's the moment where you decide, well, when should I be in what we call GPS or VLOC mode? Right? GPS mode is what you use if you're trying to get the GPS to give you guidance. A VLOC mode is what you use if you're using a VUR, a localizer, or the fancier version of localizer is iOS, right? So here's my suggestions. If you are being radar vectored to a fix, and you know that this is an iOS approach, then you switch to VLOC mode immediately at that moment so that you don't forget. In a similar way, if the approach is an RNAV approach, then the moment you're getting radar vector to fix, make sure that you switch to GPS mode. Right? And then remember which mode you're on. But in general, anytime you're being radar vector coming into your approach, you switch to the correct mode of that plate that you're on. That way you don't forget, because we call this the $1,000 button. If you forget on a check ride, that's an instant check ride fail, and that's $1,000 on a check ride. So $1,000 button. You always want to be in the correct mode because that gives you the positive course guidance, whatever you're doing. So if you're an iOS localizer, you need to be in VLOC mode. If you're in GPS RNAV approach, you need to be in GPS mode. The next things I brief from left to right, right? Localizer DME, the localizer SBA 110.3. So then at this moment, I teach my students to pause, to tune and ID the localizer frequency if they can. Sometimes you need to be pretty close to it, but at least tune the frequency. Make sure that it's the right number, 110.3. Oftentimes, we can get pilots dyslexic where we just switch numbers around and suddenly 110.3 looks like 101.3. So that's where the idea of verify, verify, verify. I like to read things out loud because then like my brain can go, no, that's not that number. Then I brief the approach course. Now, oftentimes people will like bug the final approach course. I don't do that because now if I'm not on the final approach course, I'm getting conflicting information in my mind. Let's say I'm being vectored, right? I'm being turned into a course and I'm not currently flying this approach course, then now I'm getting conflicting information. But I brief the approach course to know which general cardinal direction I should be flying when I'm eventually landing. So for example, the final approach course for the iOS runway 7 is 075. So I note in my mind as eastbound. That means at any point I'm being radar vector and I'm flying westbound, I know I'm going the wrong way and I'm aware of that. I'm aware that I'm going away from the airport. And if I'm going northbound, I know that I'm probably about to intercept the course. So I'm playing this chess game in my mind. Step 1, I'm doing this. Step 2, I'm doing this. Step 3, I'm doing this. So that's why I brief the approach course, is to plan through which cardinal direction I should be flying. The reason why I'm telling you this is many people fail the multi-engine commercial pilot check ride because the DP typically vectored the students outbound, okay, going in the wrong direction, and then they turn the students back inbound. And many, when they are flying outbound, confuse themselves and think they're flying inbound and think they're flying in the wrong direction. Then the DP simulate an engine failure. Now they have this incredible amount of workload, and they had no idea that they're continuously going away from the airport. And that's how many multi-engine check rides are unsuccessful because of that. Right? So just having this awareness of I need to eventually be going eastbound, 07 something, right? 09 something, eastbound. That's my inbound course. That gives you that situational awareness. Runway length. People usually blurb through this, blah, blah, blah. Runway length, 6,052. But I asked my student, what is the significance of it to you? Because here's the thing. If your runway length is short, like at Reed Hillview, the landing length is 2,600, that's an entirely different strategy coming into landing than landing in San Jose at 10,000 feet. Because at Reed Hillview, especially if you're flying a maybe a little bit faster airplane, an RG, a Skylane, a multi-engine, is you need to control that energy. And here's my guideline, is generally you want to be on your approach speed, which is usually pretty fast if you're in a 172, a 172 RG, a Piper Archer, smaller airplanes. You want to be around 90 knot ground speed for most of the approach. And if it's a short runway, I train my students about 2 miles from the airport is when you begin to slow down. But before that, you're going to keep up your speed for a few reasons. The approach and the terminal publication, the TPP, the IFR procedures are designed for you to be flying generally around 90 knot ground speed. That's where you're going to have all the charts information on there. But it also gives you positive course control. When we learn about holes and you read the AIM, one of the AIM suggestions is when you're flying into a hold, you want to be at least at 90 knots to have that positive control so that the wind doesn't knock you. So in general, keep up the speed. But about 2 miles from the airport, that's when you're getting ready to slow down. If you see the runway, then you add flaps. Some people are trained to add flaps before they see the runway, before they remove the toggles. We don't teach that here at Aerodynamic. The reason is because it gives you a lot of workload if you had to go miss. So generally, we teach you can fly in an approach, and around the final approach fix is when you deploy the gear. That way, if you had a gear issue, you know it early and you're at much higher altitude, you can troubleshoot, you can ask for radar vector, give you some time and distance to troubleshoot and fix it, because you need the gear to land. But we teach you just fly under the foggles if you're being simulated, or if you're an actual IMC, just fly without flaps until you see the runway and you make that commitment, I'm landing, then and only then, when you see the runway, do you begin to add flaps. So if it's a short runway, you start working that energy back about 2 miles out, slowing it down, getting ready for that flap speed. But if you're coming in a long runway, like Santa Barbara, like San Jose, where you have jets following you on your tail, you want to come in with a little bit of speeds and maybe land without flaps because you have a long runway. right? So when I brief the runway length, I pause and I think about my strategy. How am I going to land?
Just to clarify, you're talking about landing without flaps as a matter of procedure, not necessarily if you're landing at Santa Barbara, you're just gonna assume probably no flaps because it's just not better for everyone.
You can choose to land with no flaps.
Mhm.
I'm saying you don't have to always land with flaps, but you use this piece of information to make a decision for yourself, right? It depends on your piloting techniques and how comfortable you are, but you give yourself that option of sometimes I will use my drag device flaps if it's a short runway, and sometimes I will decide not to because I don't have to. You shouldn't need to land with flaps. And always the tailwheel pilots will agree with that. You don't ever need flaps if you can control your energy, your approach speed, and you can control your aircraft really, really well. The other thing that I brief when I talk about runway length is this concept of how steep is my glide slope. So for example, most approaches, the glide slope is about 3 degrees. So if you're flying around 90 knots ground speed, you're descending 500 feet per minute. At Reed-Hillview, if you're flying out of Reed-Hillview, the glide slope is actually 4 degrees, which means that your descent rate is 600, 700 feet per minute. That's the ideal. So now you got two things. You have a high descent rate coming in at Reed-Hillview, 4 degrees glide slope, and you have a shorter runway, 2,600 length because of the displaced threshold. So that's your yellow flag where you go, okay, I need to strategize my energy management differently, right? I know that I'm going to be coming in steeper descent, therefore a little faster probably, and I know the runway is short. I'm getting ready the moment I see that runway, walk back the power, add my drag device, be ready to land that airplane. So when I brief the runway length, that's the thinking I'm having in my mind. I'm not just reading 6052. I'm thinking, okay, what do I need to do to fly this really, really well? The second thing, the next thing I brief is the touchdown zone and airport elevation. Most people just collapse this as one number, touchdown zone 13, elevation 13. I get my students to start thinking about it. Because if these two numbers are the same, touchdown zone elevation is the height of the runway within the first, is it
The
first 1,000 feet or 3,000 feet? But it's the first portion of the runway. There's a definition for it. The touchdown zone is the first portion of the runway if you're coming in landing runway 7. Airport elevation is the highest elevation of the airport itself. If the two numbers are the same, it means the airport is relatively flat. You can expect that. If the two numbers are different, that's your next yellow flag, which says maybe this is a slope runway. And then I'm looking at the airport diagram and I go, well, which direction is it slope? As I'm coming into land, is it sloping down? And therefore I have a different visual illusions than if the airport is sloping up. I need to know that, especially if I'm coming into a mountainous airport. For example, landing into Calaveras, there are different airports we've practiced where the runway is sloping down, and that's entirely different visual than when it slopes up. And then there are some airports where it's a little dip, it's like a little U. So you're coming down and slope down, and as you're landing, it slopes up again. I like to brief that visual illusion, right? If it's sloping down, I'm going to be thinking, okay, maybe I'm going to be too high and allow the plane to come down. The other thing that I'm noting when I'm talking about airport elevation is how low it is, because this is my hard deck. For example, there is an airport KCPU, I think that's Calaveras, where we're flying an approach in. And the approach drops you off about 1,000 AGL, and then you have to just visually land the airplane. The problem with that airport is it's near mountains, and there's all these tall trees. It's a little bit scary. So the temptation is just to stay high, to stay above the tree. But one thing I note is the elevation is this number. That means that I better bring that plane down if I have any hope of touching down. Right? So noting the airport elevation tells me, okay, this is my heart deck. If my airport elevation is 3,000 and I'm at 4,000, that means I have 1,000 feet to go. Right? So I need to continuously descend, make sure I don't hit any trees, but continuously descend because I still have 1,000 feet to go. That's my thinking when I brief the airport elevation. Now, if you come down to the approach, and let me just shows you, this is the big picture of what we're looking at here, the IOS runway 7. So I can annotate here. We started with the name of the approach and the airport. And then we went to the date, make sure it's current. Some pilots pull out a plate and it's like 2 years old. Well, these approaches actually change. For example, the Salinas approach has changed recently. So knowing that you have the correct plates is important. Make sure you have the correct frequencies here. If you're flying a localizer or VUR, you tune that and ID if you can, which is listening for the Morse code. If you have a GPS approach and it says WAS, this is the moment to verify that you have WAS and RAIN in your airplane. WAS allows your GPS to give you very accurate information. There was a student who came into maintenance and reported that our GPS is broken. Because he said, I'm trying to fly this LPV approach that's supposed to have the glide slope, and the glide slope was not moving at all. And we discovered that he just did not turn on WAS, right? This feature in the GPS that allows you to get the accuracy, that allows the GPS to give you the glide slope. So this pilot who didn't know, who should know, claimed the plane is broken when he just didn't learn how to activate the special features on the GPS. So this is the moment. This little corner here, it'll say WAS. It was GPS, it'll say localizer frequency. Then we've done the approach course, right? Thinking what cardinal direction am I flying? Runway length, touchdown zone elevation, airport elevation. Thinking about that visual illusions.
So just to make sure, if the approach like says WAS, that means WAS is required.
Mm-hmm. Yep. If it says WAS, it means it's required for certain minimums, because there could be different minimums on that approach. Mm-hmm. There could be LPV, which require WAS, but on the same plate, it could say LNAV, which doesn't require WAS. Then you have to know which approach requires that extra WAS feature, that accuracy. Any questions so far online? Pause for a moment. Good. Okay. So we covered a name, plate, localizer, frequency, WAS, approach course, which cardinal direction I should be going eastbound, runway length, what's my strategy for coming in landing, touchdown zone, like what's the airport going to be like? Let's continue. Okay. The next portion is the notes. And what I recommend is you highlight anything that's relevant in the notes section. So for example, if you're coming in at night, you might say circling runway 15 right, not available at night. But most people just read this whole notes and then have no idea what it's saying. Right? You want to interpret and read and see which information applies to you. Okay, so VDP not authorized when Oxnard altimeter setting, when using Oxnard altimeter setting. If you're not using the altimeter setting, not important. If you're not getting local altimeter setting, use the Oxnard increased MDA. Well, if you are getting Santa Barbara altimeter setting, this note doesn't apply to you. If you're not flying Cat A or Cat C, that note doesn't apply to you. So in the notes, you're just gonna read and highlight the notes that matter to you, because you want to pull out in your mind yellow flag. Like, what is something I need to pay attention to?
By the way, I think the flight has changed recently because I'm pulling it out of my EFT and it's the press.
Yeah, so this plate I received October 3rd. Okay. Today it has changed recently, but I'm showing you a plate to analyze it. Always use the most current plate. Right. All right, this presentation I've done just a few days ago. Now let's take a look. The next portion in that briefing, in that notes section, is their MALS. A lot of people skim right through this. What in the world is that? I'll show you why this is important on a flight that I did. So highlight the relevant notes, brief the lighting at the airport, and then brief the missed approach procedure. We'll talk about lighting in a second, but here's the important things about briefing the missed approach procedure. I teach my students to read this out loud because for some reason, when people read things silently, they miss stuff. But when you read it out loud, you can't miss anything. So that audible confirmation is super important. Climb to 700. Okay, 700. And then climbing right turn 4,000. Right turn 4,000. And then on this RZS Vortec radio 185. And then to go lead and hold. So I brief it very slowly, and I'm going to show you how I break this down so that I don't miss information. Okay, let's go back to this lighting thing that most people skip over. And I used to skip over too until I discovered this. I was flying a Citation Jets coming into SFO. This is on one of my corporate flights. It's 2 a.m. in the morning. It's my birthday. I'm exhausted, right? I have to land this jet and then I get to go home. I'm flying over the bay, the San Francisco Bay. It's pitch black. I can't see anything. All I see is this, a bunch of lights plus the San Francisco city lights. It was a bit overwhelming, my first approach into SFO. And we're clear to land on 28 right. And I'm coming in, I'm over this pitch black bay. Like, which one is 28 right? I finally, I'm following the autopilot. It's guiding me down. We're disconnecting the autopilot. We got seconds before we touched down. And we finally landed 28 right. And I go, how could I have done that better? If I had just took a moment to pause and brief the lighting, I would know that 28 left should have less lighting than 28 right. 28 right should be the one that looks like a trident, right? Lots of flashing sequencing light, the red terminating lights on the right side, and then a 28 left looks more like a cross, just a bunch of dashed line. So that if I'm coming into an airport and I'm having a hard time seeing which runway is which, you can't see the runway numbers at this moment. All you see is just this flashing sequencing light. If you knew that the left one have less light and looks like a cross and the right one looks like a trident with tons of light, that's your verification. Okay, I'm lining up with the correct runway, because it's so easy to switch them and land on the wrong parallel runway. And if you land on the wrong parallel runway and you're a professional pilot, your career is over. So this stuff is really important. And from that moment on, I realized how critical it is to brief the lighting and understand what is saying. Yeah.
What was the A versus the A5?
Yes. If you go into the TPP, it has a legend that describes what it is. And then the dot means that it has sequencing light. So they have different letters to name different type of lighting system. Great. So now we go down, so we pass that briefing note and we go down to the approach. This is where I train my students to be incredibly organized with how to load information. I talk about the idea of having actually 8 frequencies, right? So 4 frequencies and then backups. If you are in an airplane that has 2 comm radios, comm 1 is typically what I train my students to use for talking, and comm 2 for listening. A lot of people switch the frequencies back and forth, and then they get confused, like, oh, I'm supposed to talk on comm 2. Wait, I'm supposed to talk on comm 1. If you just have this general strategy that whenever I'm talking, I'm going to put those frequencies in comm 1. And whenever I'm listening, monitoring something, I'm going to put in comm 2. Then you won't be confused with that. And then nav 1 and nav 2, I set them identical. They're back up to each other. The reason why I'm telling you this is because I've flown an approach in actual IMC using nav 1, and halfway through, the needle just stopped moving. Okay, like, it just got stuck. And we immediately switched to nav 2, and luckily we had it set up and we're ready for it, and it was not a big deal. If I was not ready for it, this is my moment of panic, because now I'm tuning in the frequency, I'm setting up the needles, I'm doing all that in actual IMC. Very stressful. So I always said nav 1 and nav 2 identical. This is also a suggestion from a DP who's a United captain, and she told us, like, just teach your student to set them up identical. Some people set nav 1 as the inbound frequency and nav 2 as the miss, and she suggests that you should not do that. Right? So let me give you a structure that your brain might wrap your head around, and maybe it'll work for you. Comm 1 is whatever you're talking as active, and then there should be a standby frequency. So for example, if you're talking the Santa Barbara approach, right? You're coming in, and specifically you're talking to this frequency, 125.4. The moment you hear that frequency 125.4, any frequency that's in the approach box, that means that your immediate next frequency is the next box. Right? That's probably tower. So if you're talking to 125.4, then set to tower, 119.7. And then if you're talking to tower, 119.7, then you know that your next box is ground. So set ground, 121.7. You're always ahead of the aircraft, always ahead. Active standby. Comm 2, what you're listening for. So what I train my students to listen for is the weather, the destination. But on the standby, have the weather alternate. I want to go here, but if it doesn't work out, I'm going here. Always have plan A, B, C. Right? I have multiple alternates. When we're flying corporates, we usually have 3 alternates for every airport that we're going to, because our job is to get the passengers to their destination or as close to it as possible. Oftentimes, the FAA minimums is maybe you need an alternate depending on these conditions, and then people would just pick 1 alternate. I like to think 3. I'm going here, but if it doesn't, I'm going to Rehoboth. Doesn't work out, I'm going to San Jose. If that doesn't work out, I'm going to Livermore. If that doesn't work out, I'm going to Oakland. I'm always strategizing, right? And have the priorities order. Now, if you already have one of the weather, like weather at the destination, you've written it down, you've thought through it, then you might put in, let's say you're coming into a non-tower airport and you're talking to NorCal. You might in comm 2 just monitor and listen CTAP, see who's flying. And then when NorCal tells you to now contact CTAP, then you would put it COM1. So strategize COM2, so listen, monitoring. Sometimes you're monitoring a non-target airport. And then COM1 is anytime you're trying to listen. Now in the navigational frequency, if you're setting up a VOR localizer, then active might be your inbound, and the standby is your miss. Just getting ready to swap it. If you're flying a GPS approach and you don't need any frequency on a NAV1, NAV2, it might be in your best interest to set a local VOR. The reason why I'm telling you this is because we flew in actual IMC on a GPS plan with a GPS approach. And in the middle of it, the GPS failed. Right? We could not receive GPS signal. Another set to pilot happened to them as well. It was during the time when there was the Aurora that was going on in Washington. But there are moments when the GPS just plain doesn't work. And if you plan on flying your entire flight with just GPS, that is a panic moment for you. But if you have VOR, if you have backups, it's not a big deal. Right? You're not declaring emergency because your GPS failed if you know where you're going. You just let ATC know, hey, it looks like my GPS is intermittent, probably pick it up, maybe monitoring, but right now I'm on course. We just want to let you know. And that's really helpful. Always things of contingency. The other frequencies you might see that you might not use pretty often is clearance delivery. Clearance delivery is what you would ask if you're trying to get an IFR clearance out of an airport. And then Unicom. And typically, if you're corporate pilots, Unicom is super helpful. You call Unicom if after you land, you want the plane to be immediately filled up so that you can put new passengers in. You want people to pull up a red carpet and a van to pick up your VIPs. That's when Unicoms are typically called. You might call to ask where's the nearest self-serve fuel station. So that's Unicom. Okay, so now we're going down on this approach briefing. And the next thing that I teach my student is a silly little thing that when I introduce it, it just seems so silly, but it's incredibly effective. I don't know why it works for a lot of people. And the moment I discovered this teaching tool, the students just executing so effortlessly. And it's writing a Post-it note. Okay, I'll teach you how to write it. But you write looking at this is called a plan view, which is the top-down view of what an approach is. So let's say you're flying into Santa Barbara. Here's the runway. You can always tell where the runway is because that's where all the arrows are pointing toward. So you're looking down, you're coming from Gaviota, that's the VOR. You first fly south, and then you fly eastbound, and you know it's eastbound because you brief the final approach course. So that's the top-down plan view. And then here's your profile view. This is looking from the side profile. This is the step-down altitude. The reason why I teach my students to use that Post-it note is because this stuff can be really complex to interpret in the middle of flying. And then even worse when you have a failure, like an instrument failure or an engine failure, and you're trying to interpret this. This is incredible amount of information, but also very hard for the brain to comprehend. So I'll show you an easier way to make it simple. Write in a Post-it note, fixed altitude and action. I like to call it the trigger and action sequence. That's how you build good habits. Like a trigger, I wake up in the morning. The action, I brush my teeth. Right? A trigger, I'm about to go to bed. I brush my teeth. Action, I go to sleep. So the way to build really good habits is to link whatever action you want to do with a trigger. Instead of saying, well, I'll do it whenever the moment calls, whenever I feel like it. It's very wishy-washy. And therefore, sometimes you do it at the right moment, sometimes you won't. But if you always link an action with a trigger, you will always do things at the right timing. Timing is critical when flying. So this fix in altitude is your trigger, and then you have an action. And the action might be when to make your radio calls or when to configure for landings. So here's an example. I discovered this concept when I was looking at aerobatic pilots, cockpits, flight deck, aerobatics, flight decks. What you often find in the aerobatic flight decks is these little pieces of paper. You also see it in fighter jets, airplanes sometimes. But there's tiny notes that they make for themselves so that when they're in this heat of action, when the workload is incredibly high, when they're stressed out, when they're upside down, they have this very simple thing for them to follow. And I discovered that that's what students, even IFR pilots, CFIIs need to organize their thought process. So let me break down how I would do this, okay? This is my little Post-it note. Santa Barbara, iOS 7. I write down the localizer frequency and the Morse code because it's really stressful to be trying to tune an ID, this localizer, and going, where's the Morse code? You know, which frequencies? Is it this one? Is it this one? Is it this one? I just write in my little Post-it note. It's right there. I only write the only thing that I need at that moment. Then I write down the fix, right? Gaviota, I need to be at 5,000. No lower than that. That's my heart deck. Then Habit, I need to be at 3,500. Then Goyet, 2,700. Naps is my final approach fix, 1,800. I double line it, double underline it. The reason why I do that is because if I'm flying a complex airplane with a retractable gear, that's my cue, that's my trigger to deploy the gear. I draw this lightning bolt, like the Harry Potter lightning bolt. That's the symbol for final approach fix on a precision approach, iOS, or a precision like simulating approach like an LPV, right? I draw the lightning bolt. What that tells me is once I reach that final approach fix with the lightning bolt, then I can follow my fly slope confidently. That's my trigger. I write final approach fix. I note down that a glide slope is about 3 degrees. So if I'm flying 90 knot ground speed, I'm descending 500 feet per minute. And if I have retractable gear, gear down. I write down my DA is 213. The elevations is 13, so that's like how low I should go. If I have a miss, if I'm planning to go miss, if it looks like it's kind of sketchy, then climb 700, right turn 4,000, RZ, RSC, radio 185, go to GoLET and hold. Right? Here's an example of a Post-it note that I would write. Now, what I've done is I've extracted information from a very complex approach plate, right, that might be quite overwhelming in an airplane where it's turbulence. You're getting a little nauseous from all the turbulence when ATC is talking at you and there's so much chatter and you can't even get a word in, that one of your instruments failing, your engine's on fire, and you're flying in the clouds. Like everything is happening all at once. This is what I train my students to be able to do, and they do it effortlessly because they have the simplicity of this concept of trigger and action. If I'm at Gaviota, 5,000, that's where I'm staying. I'm not doing anything. Okay. Then once I pass that, I can descend. Habit, 3,500. I also note when to call. Like Habit would be approximately 10 miles. Right? So if NorCal or SoCal, TRACON, whoever you're talking to, haven't told you a contact tower around there, around 10 miles, you might monitor and just pay attention. Sometimes they forget, and you might prompt them, hey, should I call tower now? If you're coming into a non-towered airport, sometimes TRACON forgets and you're about 10 miles, you're going to say, hey, do you think I should talk to CTAF or should I stay with you? It's really good to have that situational awareness, because the worst thing you want to do is coming in on an instrument approach at a non-towered airport, and TRACON, NorCal or SoCal, forgot to switch you. So you're not talking to CTAF, you're not talking to other pilots at this non-towered airport, you're just punching your way in. And then suddenly they remember. Sometimes they forget, they're humans. And they said, switch to CTAF, and you're like 3 miles in, busting in the middle of airspace of everyone doing traffic pattern. You've created a hazard for yourself and for everyone else. So having this trigger of, okay, if I'm at Habit, I should be at 3,500 and I should be talking to someone local. Just that awareness to remind yourself, okay, if I'm getting closer and I'm not talking to someone local, maybe I should prompt ATC. So that's one approach to do Post-it note, right? And then the final thing is the checklist. I run my checklist as soon as I'm coming close to an approach fix. Maybe is 5 miles from an initial approach fix, 5 miles from a feeder route. I'm just running it through, seeing if I miss anything. Because if I'm in actual MC, I'm in the middle of doing an approach and my engine caught on fire. Things happen really, really quick, and I really don't want to forget anything. And we talk about this idea of add flaps when you see the runway. Avoid adding flaps early so you can ready for the miss approach. So we're going to do a practice together. Here's the approach that I was talking to you about, which is the Calaveras approach CPU RNAV 3.1. And I've zoomed it in. So take a look and think about how you would write that Post-it note to summarize what is key on this approach. What are the most important things you're going to pull out for yourself in this approach? I'll give you about 5 minutes just to think about it. It's Calaveras KCPU, if it's hard for you to see online. RNAV 3.1. And we'll walk through the thinking of looking at a brand new approach and what might be important to you. Now, your Post-it note, that summary, might not be identical for every approach. It might be different depending on what you find is really important to you. So Taylor has a Post-it note if anyone want to give it a try. And we have pens too. If you have ForeFlight and you have approach downloaded, feel free to pull that up as well. If that's easier on your iPad or iPhone.
I haven't looked at it. So I guess we'll start with this. So, tables. All right.
All right, so for people online, hope you're giving it a chance with the post-it note as well, but we'll walk through it together. So the A is listening to the ATIS and extracting the weather, right? The B is briefing the approach. Does anyone have the weather KCPU right now?
Winds calm, Nevada visibility, clear for the 12.
Beautiful day.
Well above my head.
All right, Calaveras, the weather, winds calm, right? So now you're not worried about headwind, tailwind, crosswind, 10-mile statute of visibilities. Fantastic. Clouds clear below 12,000. You're not even worried about ceiling. Temperature 33 Celsius, dew point 4. So you're not thinking whether the weather is going to get worse. That looks pretty perfect. Altimeter 3005 is pretty high pressure. Humidity 16 and density altitude 3,600. Okay. So you know,
Nice.
ceiling visibility, not a big deal. Just get you thinking. And again, I ask my students this. Sorry about that. So the first code word for everyone who's following. Give me a second to update.
I mean, it is, you know, that's the innovation.
The first code word, if you are trying to get wings credit, is read, do, verify. That's how we do the IFAR checklist. Read, do, verified. If you put something in this line in the sign-in, that's great. But I want you to get the concept of the IFAR checklist. Read, brief the approach, one item at a time, do something about it. Don't just read it like you're reading a novel, and then verified, and then make decisions about it. Okay, so back to our example at KCPU right now. Wind is calm, visibility is 10 statute miles, clouds clear below 12,000. What would be some reasons why you would fly an IFR approach on a perfectly clear day? Training, okay. What else?
And what services? You want
When you-
IFR services, you want separation, you want.
Yep, when you went IFR services separations. What else?
Never been there before. That's nice. Let's get lined up.
Yeah, like if you've never been there before, it's super nice to have some guidance, especially if you're flying a mountainous airport. And if you have flown in mountains before, you know that runways are kind of impossible to find at mountains sometimes with all the trees. Oftentimes I have to be directly above a runway before I even see the runway. If you are navigating terrains, mountains, what other reasons would you fly IFR on a perfectly good day? Winds calm, 10-mile statute of visibility, clear below 12,000 feet.
Christian?
Keep proficiency. What else?
If you will, terrain clearances.
Terrain clearances, energy management. That's huge. especially if you're flying an RG, a Skylane, any fast plane where you have that manifold pressure, propeller control. Like, how fast do I need to be flying? When should I descend? The incredible power of the IFR approach is it gives you that guidance. Okay, you should be this high, this far away. You should be this fast. It gives you that guidance. On approach speed, coming in, maybe 2 miles out, start working that power back to your approach speed. Maybe further, depending on how fast your airplane is. Maybe it's 10 miles out is when you start working that energy back. Good. So the A is the ATIS, or AWOS in this case. Now let's brief. Do we start with the name of the plate, RNAV 31 Calaveras? Why is the name important?
You're not playing the problem.
So you're not flying the wrong approach, because you can be coming into Reed Hillview on an RNAV runway 31. Now, granted, it's 31 right, but there's many times when it's at night, it's dark, it's low visibility, you're pulling up a plate, and you actually chose the wrong plate because you're looking at another plate the night before, and the names are very similar, RNAV 31. There are tons of them around. There's lots of RNAV GPS runway 31. You just gotta pause in that moment and go, okay, I'm going to Calaveras County. That's the correct one. This is a GPS approach. So I should be in GPS mode. If I'm not in GPS mode, this is my trigger. Switch over to GPS mode. Unless I'm using VOR for some reason to fly toward it. But like, this is the trigger, okay? GPS mode, make sure the plate is most updated for that flight that you're doing. Then we just look left to right, top to down, top to bottom. So the first thing you look at is WAS. When would WAS be required for this particular approach? If your minimums are LP, LNAV, and circling. Some of you might know, some of you might not. So when would WAS be required and when would it not be required?
Maybe-
You guys know?
If you're
Why does it have WAS there? Anyone online know? Why does it say WAS in this?
Doesn't mean that it has the ground station, so WASP is available.
It's like if you're using a blind slope that creates for you.
Very good, Tom. So LP requires WAS. LP is localizer performance, and that gives you that precise guidance, left or right. It doesn't have to be that you need a glide slope, a vertical guidance to require WAS. Because LP, localizer performance, gives you that level precision. If you're flying to the LP minimums, in this case 1,600, then you need WAS. But if you're not planning to go that low, or like you don't require guidance that low, and you want to fly the LNAV minimums, then you don't need WAS. Or your aircraft. So for example, we have a MAW in our fleet that does not have WAS. So that plane, the MAW, can only fly to LNAV minimums, 1,860. If the clouds is below that altitude, it would not be able to fly there. And then circling is the same as the LNAV minimums. So if you are planning to fly it all the way to the LP minimum, localizer performance, 1,600 feet, in this moment, you need to make sure that you check you have RAME and WAS in your GPS. Otherwise, you won't get down that low. Or you won't get that vertical guide, you won't get that guidance low. Now, LP only gives you left or right. You often find this at Mountainous Airport, where the FAA, when they're designing this approach, they can't give you that confidence to give you the vertical glide slope. And so instead of giving you an LPV, they'll just give you LP. So in this case, we're flying at a Mountainous Airport, and we're turning, the course turns around in the mountainous valley. And so you get the LP, the left or right guidance, but you don't get the vertical glide slope.
So normally you check WAS as a part of the runner, but do you also specifically during briefing go back
Yep.
to the
Mhm.
GPS page and check the WAS right?
Absolutely. I always verify that WAS is on right before I do the approach, because that's the moment that's critical. What if somehow it got turned off during the flight? Like I mentioned, a student who completely could not fly an approach, full scale deflection, claims the airplane is broken, brings Baxton, tell the mechanics to fix the airplane, remove the GPS, all sorts of things, all because he did not turn on WAS. And we're like, you just need to be a better instrument pilot. There's nothing wrong with our airplane. But it's just a silly mistake, and you really don't want to be making this mistake in actual IMC when it really does count. When you really do need a guidance to get yourself low below the ceiling, right? We don't mind students make mistakes all the time, but what I really care about is when it counts for you, when it counts for your passenger, when it really matters and you have to go low visibility, low ceiling, that you know, hey, before I do the approach, I'm briefing, I'm checking it, I'm verifying, I'm not leaving any Swiss cheese gap. Then you brief approach course. So 311 is what approximate cardinal direction. Yeah, you should be flying toward nordish. So if you find yourself flying 180, you know you're going the wrong way. And if you're intentionally going the wrong way, that's great. But if if you weren't trying to go south, if you weren't trying to go outbound, you have a problem. Reason why I tell you this is because there was a accident that happened when a pilot was flying at night. And his strategy, he's flying down San Diego, around the LA area, and trying to go north to Paso, right? His strategy was, I'm going to just follow the coastline. Now, he started out VFR, and he's flying at night, and he's following the coastline. The problem is the coastline start turning, right? Because down south, the coastline isn't just straight up. So at one point, he started turning, and he started going westbound because he's following the coastline. As the night gets darker and the clouds start forming in, he started losing sight of the coastline, and he continues flying west. And he finds himself 2 hours later, 50 miles off the coastline in the ocean. And he goes, oh, I don't understand why I don't see anything. I should see something right now. And he realized, oh, he's talking to approach. Right? He's like, I think I'm lost. I don't know where I am. So ATC is scrambling, trying to help this guy. And they go, turn this direction. There's this airport. There's this other airport. He looks at his field gauge and starts reading empty. And ATC says, well, maybe you can reach this coastline. There's a little coastline there. And he goes, I see the coastline. I see the coastline. And he's trying to glide it. Then his field goes empty, 0 at that moment. ATC goes, are you okay? I'm gliding, sir. I'm gliding. He missed the coastline. And the NTSB report says, if only this guy had any conception of which direction he's going, if he knew that he's supposed to be going north, cardinal direction, north-ish, right? Doesn't even have to fly 360, but he knows that I should be 300 something. We could have helped him. We could have saved him. But because he was flying west 270 and he got himself so far out into the ocean, he could not glide himself in. He ran out of fuel. So this is where I really emphasize, like, know your cardinal direction. Know the terrain. Know where's the ocean, where is the mountains. There are cases also where people are flying in the mountains and the mountains on the right side and flatlands on the left side. But they weren't aware of the terrain because all they look at is the IFR low and route chart or the plates where the terrain is not obvious. For me, when I teach my students, I overlay the plate with the sectional chart because I need to know what the terrain is. So there was an accident where people were flying IFR and they lost the positive course guidance. They went off course and then they didn't know what to do. They were freaking out. They were scared. So they turned right into the mountains. And ATC and NTSB report says, if only that pilot had any awareness of terrain in this moment of panic and they turned left away from the mountains, they would have been safe. So just know your cardinal direction, know the terrain. Where's the mountains? Where's the ocean? Where's the different airspace? And I like to overlay sectional chart over these plates because oftentimes I'll do stage check with students on IFR, stage checks, and I would ask the students, where am I? No idea. I'm near this fix. Okay, but where is that? Like, where are you in relation to anything that you know? No idea. Like, you want to know, okay, I'm over the mountains right now, and San Jose is to my left. And if I have an engine failure, I'm being to San Jose. Like, that's the kind of knowledge that I train my students to have. So it's not like I'm near DCOT. Okay, what does that mean to you? Right? But like, I'm near the mountains to my right. I know flatlands to my left. I see Mission Peak. I know Mission Peak is somewhere on my right. I better not turn too far right. I know to the left is flatland. I know San Jose International is there. I know Reed Hillview is a little bit south of San Jose. I'm right kind of north of it. I'm near Mission Peak. Like, that's the kind of knowledge you want to have. All right. So let's move on. Runway length. What information does that tell you? 3,600 feet.
It's average.
Yeah, it's average. Not too scary, right? 3,600. Now, touchdown zone airport elevation, 1,300. What might that tell you?
It's gonna be probably fairly high density.
Yeah, it's flat, but higher density altitude than sea level. Right? If it's a hot day, 33 Celsius, maybe your density altitude is even higher. Your aircraft performance is now a factor. Maybe you might not be able to take off pretty soon after. So you're thinking about, okay, I want to come in for lunch and then I want to leave after I finish lunch. Well, maybe you might not be able to do that on a very hot day. That's the altitude. Circling, not authorized southwest of 3113. So if you saw that, let's see, you would put an X here. This is your airport diagram in this little box. And if you saw circling not authorized southwest, you would put an X here. To remind yourself, hey, don't go there. You would brief the missed approach, climb 4,400, direct to ZGEX, and hold. At this moment, I would pause and put in my ForeFlight, where is ZGEX? Where is that fix? The reason why I do that is because I need to know, is that fix super far away? If I knew that that was really far away and in the wrong direction away from my alternate, for example, and I think that there's a possibility that I might have to do a missed approach and go to my alternate, I might ask for an alternate missed procedure. Right? This published missed procedure might not be my best option. For example, at Reed Hillview, the missed approach procedure is to fly direct to DCOT. If you fly local area, you know that you probably won't get that. Right? The ATC don't like that missed approach procedure. They'll give you an alternate missed approach procedure. So that kind of local knowledge is really helpful to be able to anticipate and ask ATC, like, you know, it looks like I'm coming in, it's low visibility, low ceiling. There might be a chance that would need to go miss and go with my alternate. This fixed ZGEX seems pretty far away. If I go miss, can I ask you to radar vector me back to try again, or radar vector me to my next fix, to coordinate that with ATC and have that conversation with them? Oftentimes, if you're in a not so busy area, then they'll be happy to coordinate. Now, if you're in LaGuardia, New York, if you're in Las Vegas, then they just tell you what to do. And in that case, if you're flying IFR, and I've flown toward LaGuardia, New York airspace. And the way it worked there is they talk at you and you don't really respond because there's no time. So they just talk at you and you just accept whatever they give you. But have that awareness, different airspace operate differently. And be willing to ask for whatever you want. Most of the time, ATC will accommodate and be really helpful. So now you go down to this frequencies here with the AWOS. Right? That would be put in COM2 if you have 2 radios, and then you would put an alternate Calaveras. So like, what would be an alternate near Calaveras that you would fly to? Does anyone have your map? Columbia? Yeah. So you might put the AWOS for Columbia there. You might have look at the approach plate at Columbia and see what that's like and whether you would want to attempt that. And then if you hear, or if you're talking to NorCal 125.1, then you know that your next frequency is 123.0. So you can already put that in. If you're a VFR pilot and you're getting flight following, like this approach plate is also very helpful for you, right? Because here's all your frequencies in an incredibly well-organized manner. So you're not searching all around for it. It's right here. Okay, so coming down, does anyone put in your Post-it notes? What do you have?
Yeah, so IAF is at Woodard,
Uh-huh.
and it's a mandatory hold.
Okay.
Unless we're coming in from, let's see, unless we're coming in from Hawkins, we do have to make a halt. So if that's our IAF, there's a hold.
Unless you're coming from where?
From Hawkins, the other IAF that's coming from the south. But if
Okay.
if Woodard
Uh-huh.
is the IAF, then we have to make a halt.
Okay.
So
So there's no mandatory hold.
I mean, it is both an IAF and IF, and that means the hold is
No, there's no hold that is mandatory. ATC can radar vector you.
right. But I mean, if you're not getting radar vector, then there's a part of the succeed.
If you're not getting radar vector, you can use the hole to turn yourself around. Yes. Mhm.
I mean, as far as I understand, I'm basing it mostly on a podcast that Max Prescott was doing specifically on an accident that happened.
Mhm.
The pilots did not do at home and they were unstabilized. And he was talking at length that if the IAF is also an IAF, that implies that the hold there is mandatory. It's a part
Well,
of the-
it's mandatory if
Unless
you're
ATC
clear for an approach
Yeah.
to follow the approach
Right.
course.
Yeah, of course,
Yeah.
ATC can always
Mhm.
modify that, but if not, if
Yeah.
it's clear for the approach, it is a part of it.
Yeah, but I wouldn't use the term mandatory.
Right.
Right. Yeah. It depends on like what your clearance is for. Okay, good. So WebEx, what altitude?
5,000 pounds.
5,200 and then,
Then CASB,
okay.
3,700.
And what is CAXB? What's the significance of that?
That's the final approach fix.
Final approach fix?
Yeah, that's the gear down for,
Uh-huh.
and
Okay, then what else?
then Uh, then our MDA is 1600. And
Our MDA is 1,600. Thank you, Yui. Yep.
that's 270 feet a year. And for mist, we are going
There's a course change. Good, Rolf. Good catch. And what is the significance of the course change? What yellow flag would that raise in your mind? Question you're going to ask yourself is, why did it change? What is around me? Right? Especially if I knew I'm flying into mountains. At this moment, I would look at aerial view. Where is the mountains? Is it on my left or is it on my right? Am I just falling through a valley? Why is the course changing? Whenever I look at approach plate, those are the kind of questions I'm thinking about. Why is it LP and not LPV? The absence of the V, because it's a GPS approach, right? They can design the LPV if they wanted to. There's no ground base station that they need to build in. The absence of V typically means it's a mountainous airport. Okay, good. One thing that, mountains should, in this case, if you are going this way, this yellow stuff is a mountain. So mountains would be to your right and flat land would be to your left in this scenario. One thing to note is the minimums drops you off at 1,600 feet and the airport elevation is 1,300. So you have 300 feet to get down. And that's what this number here is, the height above the airport. Okay, so here is something that I might write on my Post-it note. There's no right or wrong way. This is just to get you to start thinking through and making decisions early. Calaveras RNAV runway 31. Right, making sure it's GPS, making sure I verified the correct airport. Hotbed 5,200. WUBEP 5,200. CACB is my final approach fix. I draw the Maltese cross to tell myself this is a non-precision final approach fix, as opposed to that lightning. I also note, because it's a non-towered airport, radio calls is critical. You do not want to be flying in completely silent until you're 3 miles out and you go, oh, I forgot, I need to be talking to someone. And now you're busting in through the airspace and people are like, what are you doing? I didn't even know you were there. So here's where I note. I know that somewhere between WUBEP and CACB, that's about 10 miles. I tell myself if I pass WUBEP, I should start calling in. About 10 miles inbound 3-1, following this RNAV 3-1 approach straight in. Traffic permitting. And I also write the frequency, 123.0 CTAP, so I'm not searching for information, it's right there. I note that the fly slope is about 3 degrees, so I might say to myself 500 feet per minute. The reason why I note the glide slope is because if you train with me, I teach the control performance method. And in the control performance methods, if you are trying to fly 90 knot ground speed, 500 feet per minute descent, and you're in 172, it's typically 1,800 RPM, a little bit of trim to get it down to 500 feet per minute, and then you can fly the whole approach pretty much hands off if the wind is calm. So I train my student, we could fly an entire ILS approach, an LPV approach, if the wind is relatively calm for 20 miles hands off, just controlling with our feet, with our rudder, staying really well on course. And that's the power of knowing control performance, having that incredible amount of stability. Then the next fix is ZSUM, right, which is 2,320. And I might tell myself somewhere between CACB and ZSUM, I'm going to call CTAF 5 nautical miles. Some people try to be really perfect and exact whenever they make the radio calls. I don't do that. I just tell myself about what fix I should pass when I make the radio call. This is close enough. You know, if you wait until exactly 10 nautical miles and you make your radio calls, by the time you finish your radio calls, you're probably 9 miles now. Like, it's not even that accurate anyway. So instead of looking for an exact distance, Gumson posted. So instead of looking for the exact distance, I just look for like approximately past which fix should I make the radio calls. And that's usually close enough. You could write gums on your post-it notes as well. I usually keep the post-it notes pretty clean on like what the IFR procedure is. But yeah, absolutely. If you're doing a complex airplane, maybe gums would be somewhere near the final approach fix. And then short final. So I note I would call CTAF if it's a non-tower airport, 10 miles out, 5 miles out, 3 miles out, call CTAF. And then I note the VDP, right? So in this case, the VDP we would note is 0.8. So I would write about 0.8 there. And the VDP is this point in space where if you see the runway, you can continue descending below MDA. If you don't see the runway, be prepared to execute a miss approach. And then MDA 1,600, and then a miss, climb 4,400, ZGEX, and hold. Continue, climb, and hold 4,400. So that's how I might write the post-it note. And then the final is the checklist. So ATIS AWAS, brief, and checklist. That's the ABC. We're going to do one last practice together. And then we'll see if there's anyone who have questions online. So this next approach is the VR Alpha into Watsonville. And we're coming into Jechma. We're going to do a circling into runway 20. So take a moment to look at this approach. It's a very familiar approach to most of us here at Reed Hill View. If you take check rides with DPs close by, that's definitely the approach that will likely be on your check ride. The interesting thing about this one is it's non-towered, it's a DME arc, it's a circling approach, so it trains you on a lot of things. So take 5 minutes to take a look at it. And this is our last practice. So after we're done with this practice, for those of you who are watching your time, maybe lunch is coming up. This is our last one, and then I'll show you the code word, and then we'll open up for a Q&A. And thanks for everyone online who's participating. Put in the chat box. Feel free to unmute yourself if you want to chime in as well. I love participation online.
Sorry for that.
When I train my private students or commercial students, I also train them an IFR approach, not exactly to fly it, but to monitor it because it gives them incredible amount of information. Like I use it to teach, well, how do you know how to fly a perfect approach to landing? If you're coming into Reed Hill View, you can load in the RNAV approach into Reed Hill View and follow that glide slope. And just do it visually. That gives you that idea of, okay, if I'm this far, I need to be this high. If I'm this close, I need to be this high. So it trains you to be really consistent and stable. All right, so let's go through ATIS AWAS at Watsonville right now. And we'll walk through this together. Watsonville weather, ATIS AWAS. The AWAS is WindsCom at visibility is 10, clear below 12,000. So today's a fabulous day to fly. The only problem is it's very hot. But from visibility and ceiling, it's a great day to fly. Temperature is 31 Celsius, dew point 11. So it's not going to get cloudy precipitation anytime soon. Altimeter 29907, a little bit closer to at standard 29902. Humidity 29%, a little bit humid. Density altitude 2,161. The typically Watsonville elevation is 163. So the density altitude of 2,100 is your first yellow flag. Right? Hot day, height higher, density altitude, something to watch out for in term performance. If you fly later on today, the density altitude is going to get even higher. So watch out for that climb coming out of Watsonville, especially with the mountains and the power lines along the way. So you've got an ATIS. Which runway would you land on knowing that winds is calm at Watsonville? 20. Right? Watsonville, everyone loves 20. Even when the wind doesn't prefer 20, everyone goes to 20. Sometimes having local knowledge is really helpful. So let's take a look at the approach. The first thing you're going to ask yourself is, why in the world is it curved? Like this whole DME arc. Does anyone know why DME arc even exists? Why would they make curved lines?
Because that's the safe area and essentially it's a convenient way of making sure that we don't get too close. Same before we're on the right radial.
Yeah, so typically that DME arc, you don't find it too often, but in some places they do exist. You might be avoiding terrain, which is what's happening in this case. If you find this arc and you're looking visual outside, you're curving around that edge of the mountains that's right next to Salinas. But DME arcs are designed to connect you. That's what you need to know, is it connects you typically from a Victor Airways to an inbound course or to another Victor Airways, from an en route structure to the final approach structure. So first, know the purpose of DME arc. It's not there to be like silly, just flying in circles, but it connects you. If you overlay this approach, the VOR alpha approach, over the IFR low and route charts, you will find that it connects two Victor Airways. One Victor Airways is at Judgma, Victor 111 that goes to Hens toward Hollister, and then there's another Victor Airways toward that connects at Jetsy. But you would be flying, let's say, en route structure on Victor 111. You reach Judgma, and then you're going to catch this DME arc to go inbound. So that's the purpose of DME arc. And then you're curving around in this case because there's a mountains right here. Okay, so let's briefly approach again. The first we mentioned is the VOR alpha Watsonville. What is the significance of the fact that it's a VOR approach? What yellow flag might that raise for you?
Well, that means we're not really getting precision guidance.
Yeah, so VOR approaches are not as precise. VOR are one of the earliest technology that we have, and then we have the iOS, and then we have the GPS, right? So the VOR is not precise. What's the significance of it being a letter, alpha?
It means it doesn't go to any particular runway, it's a certain number.
Yeah, so if there is no number, It means it's not lining you up with any exact runway at all. It's all circling. So the first thing you note, this is your yellow flag in your mind. This is not very precise and it's not lining me up to a new runway, and I'm going to need to circle. You want to attempt this approach on a day where maybe you have a little bit higher ceiling, more visibility, because circling approaches are harder to fly or more challenging. It can be dangerous at times too. Oftentimes it's best to just fly straight in if you're in an IVAR approach, and then just land straight in at the airport. It's easier to control the aircraft that way. So your mind, when you read that name, like a little yellow flag should go in your mind. Okay, not very precise. I'm gonna need a circle. I'm not quite lining up to any runway. I pay attention to this. Then we go next, Vortec SNS. So I'm using the Salinas VOR frequency 117.3. Now, if you've been flying recently, you might know that the Salinas VOR was enough for a little bit. So that would make it hard to fly a VR approach if the VOR is enough, right? To be able to fly it precisely. So you might check, tune and ID the frequency, listen for the Morse code, make sure that you can hear it. This channel number is for military, so you, as a GA pilot, so you don't have to really pay attention to it. Then you note your final approach course. It should be north-ish, right? Northwest-ish. So if you're flying eastbound and you're, well, hopefully you're at JETSI and flying eastbound-ish, going toward the final course. But if you're at JESHMA trying to do this DME arc, and you find yourself trying to do the DME arc, which pointed to the west, and you find yourself somewhere along the line flying a heading of 090, you're going the wrong way. You're going the wrong direction. So if you are catching this approach at JESHMA, initially you should be flying a cardinal direction. I always talk cardinal direction. Some pilots talk left or right. I should be turning left. I should be turning right. I don't teach left or right. I teach cardinal direction. Because if you set your VOR on the wrong frequency, you set the wrong OBS, and you have that reverse sensing, your left or right is all weird. But that cardinal direction will always work for you. So if you're in the mindset of should we go left or right, I invite you to consider a different approach, which is what cardinal direction should I be flying? So if you're at JESHMA, cardinal direction should be westbound, and then cardinal direction should be northwest. Okay? Runway length, NA, touchdown zone, NA. Because it's not lining you up for any runway. Airport elevation, 163. Can someone look up for me the definition of touchdown zone elevation? How far is it down the runway?
I think it's the first third or first 1,000 feet, whichever is like.
Let's see. Touchdown zone elevation, the highest elevation, the first 3,000 feet of the runway, starting at a threshold. The first 3,000 feet of the runway. It doesn't mention first third for me.
If your runway's 3,000 feet long.
Yeah.
It's the entire runway.
And then it's gonna-
Yeah, so according to FAA, highest elevation, first 3,000 feet of the landing surface. And in this case, it's NA because this approach is not leading you to any approach, to any specific runway at all. It's circling. Circling not authorized west of runway 2 and 20. So you can look at 2 and 20, and you put an X here. Right? Not allowed west of runway 2 and 20. When local altimeter not received, use Monterey and increase all the MDAs, so all your minimums, 80 feet. DME is required. So you need to have either DME or GPS as substitution. And circling runway 27, not authorized at night. So you would put an X here if you're flying at night.
Oh, it says west of 0.
Hmm?
It's circling not authorized west of runway.
Yeah. So
You put the X east of it.
She was on
Well,
the second part about circling
Oh,
runway
oh,
Yeah.
two and not
I see.
Yep.
at night.
so circling
So it's-
west, not authorized,
that's that.
and not authorized at night, 27. Good. This approach, climbing left turn to 5,000 feet, direct Salinas Vortex and hold. Continue climb and hold. So you might ask yourself, well, where does this missed approach put me? I start flying toward the ocean, which is fine because it's flat land, but try not to go too far, right? You're just gonna execute a left turn and then fly direct to Salinas. But here is your action in this moment. That tells you, okay, I'm inbound 117.3. My frequency, my miss is also Salinas Vortex. But I'm going to be flying direct Salinas Vortex, so I need to remember how to fly direct to Salinas Vortex if I'm using VOR. Right? Center the needle, make sure it's 2, fly the heading on top, fly direct to Salinas Vortex. So thinking about that, then here's your frequency. So ASOS, that's your weather. That should be in COM2. What would your alternate be if you're trying to land in Watsonville?
Salinas.
Salinas, Monterey, Marina, but maybe those are coastline and they might all be socked in. And maybe Hollister would be your next best thing, depending on where you're going, right? Hollister, Saint Martin might be good options too, depending on what you're doing and where you're trying to go. If you're talking to NorCal 127.15, then your standby is immediately Unicom. As you're coming in, if you've already gotten the weather, the ASOS weather, and you're just talking to NorCal and they're just switching you from different frequencies, sometimes it's a good idea to just put Unicom on COM2 just to listen in how many pilots are in the traffic pattern. Are they doing a bunch of landings and now I have to sequence myself in? Is it just one guy landing and then he's exiting the runway? Is it pretty clear? I like to have that situational awareness. The other thing I use is a Sentry ADS-B device. So as I'm coming into the approach, I want to see how many people are buzzing the airport, strategizing how am I going to enter because I'm entering the traffic pattern now. And then coming down to this plan view. Now this is a little bit trickier because you are now doing a circling, right? So you're coming in, this approach is perfect for a 45 degrees entry. If you're landing 2-0, then it's a left downwind, left base final. So I'll show you how I would write this. Oops. There you go. Watsonville Alpha approach. So if I'm starting at Judgma, 3,700, and then a Kinu, I'm doing this DME arc, 8 DME. It's a Salinas VOR. Here's my frequency. This is my Morse code. I just draw the Morse code. So in the heat of the moment, when I'm high pressure, I'm not searching for the Morse code. I'm not trying to do the finger pinching to zoom it in to see what the Morse code is. I've drawn it out for myself. Once I arrive at Kinu, 3,700, that's my altitude. I'll call in CTAF. I'll tell them 10 miles. Inbound 20. Here's my frequency for CTAF. So I'm not searching for it. I know a diner. That's my final approach fix, 2,400. This is my Maltese cross. That's the signal. This is a non-precision final approach fix. Maybe if I have gear, that's when I deploy the gear. I call in CTAF again. I tell them, hey, I'm 5 miles inbound, runway 20. I note my MDA is 1,300. As I'm coming in, I'll call in again, 3 nautical miles, entering on the 45. We'll plan to do the traffic pattern, runway 20. And then I would note when I begin circling what the TPA is. So I know that if I see the runway, I note, okay, traffic pattern altitude is 1,200. If I see the runway, I can go lower. But because I'm flying this approach, I want to do a normal traffic pattern. So I note what the TPA is, because in the middle of me doing the circle and low visibility, I do not want to be searching in ForeFlight. What is the TPA? I can't find it. Very stressful moment. This Post-it note is so powerful. Okay, TPA is 1,200. When can I do the circling? 1.3 or closer. That's my circling radius if I'm in a category A airplane. So 1.3 or closer, I might begin entering. So my calls will be entering on a 45, runway 20, and then left downwind, runway 20, left base 20, and then final 20. The reason why I write these calls out is because it's impressive how many IFR pilots, CFII pilots that I've flown with, who makes the weirdest radio calls on a circling approach. Like we would be in downwind and they'll call that we're upwind, and we'll be on base and they call that we're on crosswind. This is incredibly dangerous for us, because if you're making your radio calls and you're saying you're in the wrong place, that's very confusing to other pilots. They'll think they're avoiding you, and in fact, they're about to fly into you, right? So to prevent that, and it's so common, and this is why I'm talking about this, it's so common for people to make the weirdest radio calls when they're doing circling approach. The workload is so high, the stress level is high, airplanes, turbulence, there's lots of people talking CTAP. I just write down. I just write exactly what I'm going to call. Right? Watsonville traffic, 54102, 10 miles inbound, runway 20. Watsonville traffic, 54102, 5 miles inbound, runway 20. Watsonville traffic, 54102, 3 miles inbound, runway 20. Watsonville.
Where you are located.
Yeah, so 10 miles southeast. Yep, 10 miles southeast, 5 miles southeast, 3 miles southeast, inbound 20. And then Watsonville traffic, 54102, entering under 45. Runway 20, Watsonville traffic, 54102, left downwind 20, left base 20, final 20. If you plan this out, then your entire flight is super easy. It becomes automatic. But if you don't, if you just stay here and this is all your game plan, this will get super stressful very quick. And in the moment you need that key critical information, for some reason, your mind just can't read. Like, what is the Morse code? What is the frequency? And you blank out. But taking just 5 minutes, 10 minutes, thinking it through, making the silly little Post-it note, capturing all the critical information, thinking through every piece of information, not like you're reading a novel, like just, okay, he did this, she said this, this happened, but thinking, okay, so it's the FAA is telling me this piece of information. What do I do with it? What is the meaning of it? What action would I take? When would I take that action? So critical. So that concludes the last practice. If you're interested in learning more, I have an IFR ground school that starts next week. It's accelerated. It happens for 5 weeks. Anytime that you do IFR ground school with us, all future ground school classes are free, and you're always welcome to join. For a refresher, you can pop in different classes too if there's topic that you're interested in. So here's the schedule that Sorry, it's a little bit pixelated, but here's the schedule. We'll talk about all these things in details. The first class is Saturday, Introduction to IFR Proficiency Pilot Qualifications. The second is like basic attitude flying. Then the big picture, VOR, DME ARCs. Then we'll talk about iOS Localizer, LDA, GPS, RNAV, LPV, LP, LNAV, VNAV, LNAV, LNAV plus V, what all those letters mean. And we'll talk about holding, procedure, circling approach, departure and route and arrival, low altitude, high altitude operations, so if you're flying jets, meteorology, ADM, and crew, resource management. So this surprised many people, but crew resource management is a mandatory topic that you need to be trained on during your IFR training, but most CFII have never heard of it and have never taught it. And most people come out of their IFR training not knowing anything about it. So I want you to know that CRM is mandatory, and if your II is not teaching you that, then ask someone to teach you that, because it's very important. And then instrument malfunctions. So for any of you guys who want Wings credit, your second code words is fix, altitude, and actions. Okay, that's the key when you're writing that tiny Post-it note, incredibly powerful. Maybe it's more like a grocery list, like a bigger Post-it note for some of you. But what I want you to get out of this whole lesson is extracting out what are you given and what does it mean to you. Don't just listen to ADAS to win 250 at 3 for the fact that's 250 at 3. But think about, what am I going to do with that piece of information? What does it mean when the altitude, the density altitude is 3,000 feet? Like, how is that going to change my decision? If it's more than 3,000 feet at aerodynamic density altitude, you need a mountain checkout. Like, you can't just fly and take off. Yeah, so it changes your decision making. And then if you didn't get to see this, please sign in for your credit. You can scan, put it in, and then that allowed me to submit to the FAA that you've attended this meeting. I'm also going to put the recording on YouTube, so if at some point you checked out, you fell asleep, or you just want to rewatch it again, it's going to be on YouTube as well. You have my email at the bottom. If you have any questions, let me know. Is there any questions online before we sign off? You can put in a chat box. You can turn on your mic.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I hope you learned something. I developed this new lesson just recently because I signed off like 10 people in 1 month. And it was a very fast-paced training for everyone. And I had to figure out, like, how do I train people to fly very complex airplane to this incredible level of precision and standard super quickly? And this was the key for me, is having a very methodical structure. And it helps everyone to be able to fly really, really well. Especially when there's an emergency, they handle it flawlessly. So, thanks everyone for attending. Also, if any of you guys are interested in careers, professional careers, airline, or you're just curious what the journey for someone is, in an hour from 1 to 4, we're going to have a career panel, and airline pilots, corporate pilots are going to come in. There'll be great interactions as well. So you're welcome to join as well.
Is that one gonna be online?
Yep. Everything always online, recorded in person.
Is there a link on like aerodynamics?
So see everyone next time. Thanks for joining. I'll stop our recording now. Feel free to email me if you have any questions.